Claire Turner was the adored school teacher who inspired children every day, and David Turner was the successful architect admired by neighbors for his quiet charm. But behind their picture-perfect marriage was a secret affair that would ignite betrayal, unleash rage, and end in a horrifying murder that shocked an entire community. Claire Turner was the kind of woman who seemed to hold everything together. To the outside world, her life looked nearly perfect. She was a school teacher in a small suburban town, admired for her dedication to her students and her endless patience. Parents spoke of her with respect, students adored her, and her colleagues often leaned on her for guidance. She had a gentle presence that filled any room, the sort of calm that made even restless children sit still and listen. For many, Claire was more than a teacher. She was a role model of kindness and strength. At home, her life seemed equally steady. She was married to David Turner, a well-regarded architect who designed houses across the county. His work kept him busy, and he often left early in the morning and came home late at night, but their neighbors never suspected anything was wrong. The Turners were seen as a stable, respectable couple who had built their life on trust and hard work. Their two-story house sat neatly on the corner of Willow Lane, with flower beds Claire tended each spring, and a freshly painted porch David had proudly built himself. From the outside, everything appeared serene, but perfection has a way of cracking under pressure. While most people saw only the surface, there were small signs of strain that went unnoticed by all except those who looked closely. David's work often took priority over family life. He was dedicated to his projects, sometimes so much that he spent weekends away or nights at the office. His absence became a silent shadow in their marriage. Claire often went to bed alone, staring at the ceiling with thoughts she dared not voice. She smiled at gatherings and put on a cheerful face for the children at school, but inside she felt a growing emptiness that David failed to see. The truth was that Claire had begun to feel invisible. She longed for the days when David paid her attention, when he would surprise her with flowers, or linger in conversation about their future. But those days had faded into the background of deadlines, business calls, and architectural plans. The life they had built together had grown quiet, predictable, and lonely. Claire tried to fill the void with her work. She poured her energy into her students, staying late to help struggling children or to prepare engaging lessons. The parents applauded her commitment, but few knew that her long hours were also a way to avoid returning to an empty house. Neighbors began to notice her walking alone in the evenings, often with her phone pressed to her ear. They assumed she was catching up with family or discussing school matters, never imagining there could be something else behind her distracted expression. At times her face carried a sadness that contradicted the cheerful woman they thought they knew. Even in her smiles there was a flicker of distance, a hint that her mind was somewhere else entirely. David, for his part, believed he was providing for their future. He worked tirelessly to secure new projects, hoping to give them the kind of life most couples only dreamed of. He didn't see that in Essing's success. He was slowly losing the very person he was trying to protect. When Claire withdrew, he chalked it up to stress or fatigue. He assumed her long hours at school were just part of her dedication to teaching. He never asked the questions that might have revealed the truth, and Claire never offered answers. Their silence grew louder than any argument could have. Still, when people saw them together in public, the image remained intact. At school events, Claire stood by David's side, smiling for photographs. At community gatherings, David spoke proudly of his wife's career. They fit the mold of a respectable couple in a quiet town, admired by all who knew them. It was a portrait of stability, but portraits can hide what's behind the frame. The cracks in their marriage were hidden well, but they were widening. Claire's loneliness was not just a fleeting feeling, it had begun to consume her, to shape her choices in ways that would soon take her down a dangerous path. David's distance, though unintentional, left her searching for comfort elsewhere. What seemed like small shifts, the late nights, the distracted walks, the private phone calls, were the early signs of something far more serious, and though no one could see it then, those quiet moments of disconnection were leading them toward a tragedy that would shock everyone who thought they knew the Turners. The stage was set for what would become one of the most horrifying crimes the town had ever witnessed. What began as the slow unraveling of a marriage was about to spiral into something much darker, with consequences neither Claire nor David could escape. Claire's loneliness deepened as the months slipped by, each day blending into the next with little change. She arrived at school early, stayed long after the students had gone home, and often lingered in empty classrooms, as if avoiding the quiet of her own house. Teaching had once been her greatest joy, but now it became her refuge, a way to distract herself from the hollowness of her marriage. What began as dedication to her students gradually transformed into something else entirely, a way to fill the silence David had left behind. It was during one of these long evenings at school that she grew closer to Michael Reed, a younger teacher who had recently joined the staff. He was charismatic, full of energy, and unburdened by the weight of routine that seemed to follow Claire everywhere. At first, their interactions were harmless, short conversations in the staff room, laughter exchanged over shared frustrations with paperwork. Michael often lingered after hours as well, preparing lessons or tidying up. Their paths crossed frequently, and with each encounter the connection between them grew stronger. Claire found herself drawn to Michael's enthusiasm. He listened when she spoke, paid attention to the small details of her life, and offered compliments that made her feel seen again. The way he noticed the books she carried or remembered a story she had told made her realize how invisible she had felt in her own home. The conversations stretched longer, spilling over from school topics into personal stories, dreams, and regrets. What began as companionship slowly morphed into something riskier, something Claire tried to resist but couldn't ignore. It was not long before their closeness developed into secrecy. They began meeting outside of school, always careful to avoid places where they might be recognized. Coffee shops in neighboring towns, quiet walks in the park, even late-night phone calls when Claire was sure David was asleep. These moments became the highlights of her days. Michael filled the void David had unknowingly created, and in him she found excitement and passion that she thought she had lost forever. But secrecy has its own weight, and Claire carried it with her everywhere. The guilt gnawed at her, though she tried to bury it beneath justifications. She told herself that David's distance had driven her into Michael's arms, that she deserved the happiness she had been denied. At the same time, she feared what would happen if the truth came out. Her carefully built life, her reputation at school, her image in the community, all of it could collapse with a single mistake. That fear, however, did not stop her. The more time she spent with Michael, the harder it became to let go. She convinced herself she could live in both worlds, playing the devoted wife at home and the passionate lover in secret. For a while it seemed to work. David, consumed with work deadlines and travel, didn't question her late nights. He believed she was simply dedicated to her students. But David was not as oblivious as Claire thought. Small changes in her behavior began to catch his attention. She guarded her phone with a new password, a habit she had never practiced before. She grew evasive when he asked about her long evenings at school. When he reached for her hand, she sometimes pulled away, distracted by thoughts she couldn't share. David didn't speak of his suspicions, but inside a seed of doubt had been planted. Meanwhile, Claire grew more reckless. She underestimated David's watchfulness, mistaking his silence for indifference. In reality, David was quietly observing, piecing together the inconsistencies. He noticed the perfume she wore on nights she claimed to be buried in lesson plans, the way she returned home with a faint glow that didn't come from grading papers. He studied her patterns, saying nothing but storing every detail in his mind. Claire's affair with Michael was no longer just a secret relationship. It had become a ticking clock. Each stolen glance at school, each hurried meeting outside, carried the risk of exposure. And as the months went on, the boundaries between her two lives blurred. She began imagining a future with Michael, one where she didn't have to hide, one where she could be free from the cold distance of her marriage. But those dreams came with danger. She had built her world on lies, and lies never remain buried forever. The life Claire thought she could balance so carefully was beginning to crumble, and the consequences of her choices were drawing closer with each passing day. What she didn't realize was that David had already begun to suspect the truth. His quiet observation was slowly transforming into certainty, and once he uncovered what Claire was hiding, there would be no turning back. David's suspicions grew heavier with each passing week. He had always prided himself on being logical, steady, and composed, a man who approached life with careful planning. But now, beneath that calm exterior, he carried a storm of doubt. He told himself repeatedly that he was imagining things, that Claire's distance was nothing more than stress from her demanding job. Yet every small detail chipped away at that fragile denial. Her late-night returns no longer matched the hours she once kept. Her phone, once left carelessly on the counter, was now never far from her reach. Even her laughter, once shared freely with him, seemed reserved for someone else. The breaking point came one evening, when David decided he could no longer sit with uncertainty. He followed Claire, careful to keep a distance so she wouldn't notice. His heart pounded as he trailed her car, each turn sharpening the dread that had been festering inside him. She drove not toward the school, as she had claimed, but to a parking lot on the edge of town. There, under the dim glow of a streetlight, David saw the truth he had been trying to avoid. Claire stepped out of her car, and moments later, Michael appeared. They embraced with a tenderness that spoke volumes. The sight was like a knife to the chest. Rage, humiliation, and grief surged all at once, leaving David breathless. He stayed hidden, watching the embrace stretch into a kiss, his hands tightening around the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. In that moment, every doubt hardened into certainty. His wife was betraying him, and the life he thought he had built so carefully was nothing more than a fragile illusion. When David returned home that night, he acted as though nothing had changed. He moved through the rooms of their house with mechanical precision, masking the torment that consumed him. But inside, something had shifted irreversibly. The man who once buried himself in blueprints and building plans now devoted that same meticulous focus to darker thoughts. He couldn't bear the image of Claire in another man's arms, nor the whispered humiliation that would come if their community learned the truth. The betrayal festered until it no longer felt like heartbreak but like an insult that demanded retribution. Claire, unaware of what David had seen, carried on with a dangerous sense of ease. She still met Michael in secret, convinced her husband remained blind to her affair. The confidence in her deception made her careless. She no longer tried to hide the glow on her face after their meetings or the change in her demeanor. To her, the silence in her marriage meant David was too wrapped up in his work to notice. What she didn't realize was that silence had become his weapon. David's thoughts turned darker with each day. He replayed the scene in the parking lot again and again, the betrayal etched permanently in his mind. He thought of the years he had given to Claire, the sacrifices, the trust, and how quickly it had been discarded. At first he considered confrontation, but the idea twisted into something more violent. Words would not undo what he had seen. Apologies would not erase the humiliation. The only resolution that made sense in his mind was one that ensured Claire would never betray him again. In the privacy of his thoughts, David began to plan. His profession had trained him to think systematically, to account for every detail, and now that same skill was redirected toward destruction. He considered timing, location, and the narrative he would present afterward. He studied her habits, noting when she came home, when she was most vulnerable, and how best to conceal what he intended to do. Each step was laid out as though he were designing one of his projects, except this time, the blueprint was for murder. Claire remained oblivious to the danger, her mind occupied with dreams of a future that no longer included her husband. She even spoke to Michael about the possibility of leaving David someday, imagining a life where they could be together without secrecy. Her words were filled with hope, but she never realized how quickly those hopes would be shattered. The atmosphere in the Turner household grew heavier, though Claire failed to see it. David's silence was not the indifference she assumed. It was calculation. Every look, every measured word concealed a storm building behind his calm exterior. He moved through the days with precision, waiting for the right moment. What had started as suspicion had become certainty, and certainty had transformed into resolve. The balance of their lives, once so fragile, was about to collapse completely. David's discovery had set events into motion that could not be reversed. While Claire dreamed of new beginnings with her secret lover, her husband was preparing to end everything in a way that no one in their quiet town could have imagined. The breaking point had come, and from it there would be no return. The night of the murder began like so many others. The air was cold, sharp with the bite of late autumn, and the Turner home sat in silence. Claire returned later than usual, her car rolling into the driveway well past 10. She carried with her the fatigue of a long day, but also the faint glow of secret happiness, the kind of light that came not from exhaustion but from stolen moments with Michael. She unlocked at the front door, expecting to step into the same quiet stillness she always did, unaware that David was waiting. The house was dim, the only light coming from a lamp in the corner of the living room. She set her bag down, kicked off her shoes, and called David's name softly, expecting no answer. She thought he would be asleep in their bedroom, the way he often was when she returned late. But David was not asleep. He was watching from the shadows, his body tense, his mind consumed by the betrayal he could no longer ignore. For days he had carried his plan like a carefully guarded secret. He had chosen this night deliberately, waiting for the moment when Claire would be most vulnerable, when the quiet of their home could mask what he was about to do. Every detail had been considered, every possible explanation mapped out in his mind. He believed he could outsmart suspicion, that he could weave a story convincing enough to protect him. As Claire bent to gather the mail from the table, David struck. The attack was sudden, fueled not by passion alone, but by the meticulous calculation of a man who had already decided her fate. The blow came quickly, a force she never saw coming, and in an instant, the air was filled with chaos. Claire's body crumpled to the floor, the light in her eyes extinguished before she had a chance to understand what was happening. For David there was no hesitation, no second thoughts, only a grim determination to finish what he had started. When the silence returned, it was heavier than before. Claire lay motionless, her life stolen in the place she thought she was safest. David stood over her, his breathing ragged, his mind caught between the reality of what he had done and the plan he had crafted to conceal it. The rage that had driven him moments earlier ebbed into cold calculation. Now it was time to erase the truth. He moved quickly, staging the scene to mimic a burglary gone wrong. He pulled open drawers, scattering their contents across the floor. Jewelry boxes were overturned, though he deliberately left valuable items untouched to avoid suspicion of Leth as a motive. A vase was smashed, its shards glittering across the rug. He left the back door slightly ajar, a silent invitation to the idea of an intruder. Every movement was deliberate, part of the story he wanted investigators to believe. When he finally stepped back, surveying the chaos, he convinced himself it was convincing. The home no longer looked like the site of a planned murder but of a violent intrusion. To anyone who entered, it would appear as though Claire had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. David rehearsed his own role in the tragedy, preparing the face of a grieving husband, the voice of a man broken by loss. The following morning, the discovery shocked the community. Claire, the beloved teacher, had been found dead in her own home. The news spread quickly, reaching neighbors, colleagues, and students who could hardly comprehend what had happened. At the school, children cried openly, clinging to each other as teachers struggled to comfort them. Parents whispered in disbelief at the gates, struggling to explain to their children how someone so kind, so cherished, could be gone. David played his part with precision. He recounted a story of working late, of returning home to find his wife's body and a house in disarray. His grief appeared real to those who saw him, his devastation convincing enough to earn sympathy. Neighbors offered condolences, police officers offered reassurances, and for a moment, it seemed his plan might succeed. But beneath the sorrow, there were already questions. Investigators examined the scene with careful eyes, noting details that didn't quite align with the narrative. Nothing of real value had been taken. The ransacked drawers looked more like theater than desperation, and the way Claire had been attacked suggested not random violence, but personal rage. Still, David held steady, convinced of his ability to outwit suspicion. He attended the memorial services, accepted the sympathies of the community, and spoke of Claire with a voice that trembled just enough to sound authentic. Yet in the quiet corners of the investigation, doubts were growing. The staged burglary was not as flawless as David believed, and the truth he tried to bury was already beginning to rise. The night of Claire's murder was not only the end of her life but the beginning of David's unraveling. What he thought was a carefully crafted escape from exposure was, in reality, a fragile mask, one that would soon begin to crack under the weight of evidence and suspicion. The tragedy had stunned the town, but the most horrifying truth was still to come. The investigation into Claire Turner's murder began with urgency. A beloved school teacher killed in her own home sent ripples of fear through the quiet suburban town. Detectives arrived determined to find answers, combing through every detail of the supposed burglary. At first glance the scene seemed chaotic, but to trained eyes, something felt staged. The drawers were pulled open but not thoroughly searched. Valuable electronics sat untouched, and the jewelry scattered on the floor was of little interest to a real thief. The puzzle pieces did not align. David presented himself as a grieving husband, a man whose life had been shattered overnight. He spoke carefully about his whereabouts, explaining he had been working late at his office when the tragedy occurred. He wept during interviews, his voice breaking as he described finding Claire. To the neighbors and community, his sorrow appeared genuine. They brought casseroles, flowers, and words of comfort, believing him to be another victim of this cruel crime. But investigators were less convinced. His story contained gaps, and his performance, while convincing to others, seemed too controlled to those trained to look beyond appearances. The autopsy revealed further clues. Claire's injuries indicated a level of violence inconsistent with a burglary. The force behind the blows suggested rage, the kind of personal fury rarely displayed by a stranger. Detectives began to wonder whether this crime had been committed by someone who knew her well. As they dug deeper into her personal life, a picture emerged that was far more complex than anyone expected. It was through interviews with colleagues that investigators learned of Claire's growing closeness to Michael Reed. Whispers of late nights spent together and unexplained absences began to surface. At first, suspicion briefly shifted toward Michael. Could he have been involved? Could jealousy or a secret falling out have led to violence? Michael was questioned thoroughly, his alibi checked against the timeline. In the end, his whereabouts on the night of the murder were confirmed, clearing him as a suspect. What remained, however, was the undeniable fact that Claire had been unfaithful. This discovery turned the spotlight back onto David. The grieving husband now had a powerful motive: betrayal. Detectives re-examined his alibi with greater scrutiny. Security cameras near his office showed no known of his presence during the critical hours he claimed to be working. Phone records revealed inconsistencies as well. His calls and messages did not match the timeline he presented. The carefully constructed story he had told began to unravel. Forensic evidence sealed his fate. His fingerprints were found on several items that had been disturbed during the supposed burglary. If an intruder had ransacked the house, why would David's prints be fresh on objects he rarely touched? The investigators pieced together the truth. The burglary had been staged, and the killer was not a stranger who entered their home but the man who lived there. When confronted with the mounting evidence, David's calm exterior began to fracture. The image he had worked so hard to protect, the successful architect, the devoted husband, the wronged widower, crumbled under the weight of reality. The community that had once admired him now recoiled in shock as the horrifying truth came to light. David Turner had not only killed his wife, but had done so with cold calculation, masking his crime in a desperate attempt to preserve his reputation. The trial that followed gripped the town. Courtrooms filled with those who had once considered the Turners a picture of stability. Teachers, students, and neighbors listened in disbelief as prosecutors detailed the events leading to Claire's death. The story was one of betrayal, rage, and meticulous planning. Every step of David's cover-up was exposed, every lie dismantled by evidence. The affair with Michael was laid bare not as a crime in itself but as the catalyst that set everything in motion. Claire's students wrote letters that were read aloud in court, their young voices describing the kindness of a teacher who had believed in them. Parents spoke of the hole left in the community, colleagues of the loss of a friend. The weight of their words stood in stark contrast to the coldness of the man on trial. David's silence during much of the proceedings only amplified the horror of what he had done. In the end, the jury delivered a verdict that shocked no one who had followed the evidence. David Turner was found guilty of murder, sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. The man who once built homes would now live in a cell, his future destroyed by the same careful planning he once used to construct a life with Claire. For the community, the tragedy left deep scars. The story of Claire's death became a cautionary tale, whispered in the halls of the school and across the dinner tables of the neighborhood. It was a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that even the most seemingly perfect lives could hide darkness within. For Michael, the guilt of being entangled in the story lingered, though he bore no legal blame. For David, the punishment was both his confinement and the knowledge that his own hands had destroyed the life he once cherished. The horrifying murder of a school teacher, born out of secrecy and betrayal, ended in tragedy not just for Claire, but for everyone connected to her. What began as a perfect picture of suburban stability unraveled into a nightmare, proving that behind even the most ordinary doors, unspeakable darkness can dwell.